Our episodes are brought to you by our awesome EDHCC Club, aka the Patron Pledgehammers. Thank you for making our content possible. If you'd like to support the channel and get some sweet bonuses, check out our Patreon link in the description below. Welcome to episode 201 of EDH Commander Challenge. I'm your host, BT, and not just that, I'm the lucky to be alive BT. You see, this episode was mostly edited and set to air at the beginning of the month, but then as they would say in D&D, I rolled a critical failure. I was on my 3-week vacation from work, and 1 week in, I tested positive for COVID-19, and worse off, I also got pneumonia at the same time. 2 things I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. I want to apologize to each and every one of you for not updating you until now, but aside from my physical health, my mental health was so bad that at times I wasn't sure I'd survive this. But thanks to some really awesome support from my girlfriend, my family, and my friends, I'm feeling a bit better. Sadly, I'm still very far from 100%, as you can even hear in my voice. However, I didn't want 2022 to come to an end without giving you guys at least one more episode, and I really hope you enjoy it. Thank you as always for the patience and support. I love you guys very much. I wish you happy holidays, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and I'll see you again in 2023. For the final time this year, let's go check out those opening hands. First, in this corner, with an opening hand of Firelit Thicket, Waterlogged Grove, Rejuvenating Springs, Beast Whisperer, Finhorn Elves, Arbor Elf, Philbert the Lost, and his Tamir-style general, Animar Soul of Elements. He is from the bloodline of champions. This is Daniel. Next, in this corner, with an opening hand of an Island, Exotic Orchard, Prismatic Vista, Dimir Signet, Soul Ring, Cackling Counterpart, Conjurer's Closet, and his Dimir-style general, Gyruda, Doom of Depths. This man is our beloved Commander Mechanic, and his name is Chris. Chris won the dice roll to start us off, so let's begin our latest Commanderfesta card fight. For their first turns, Chris plays an Island into a turn 1 Soul Ring, then into a Dimir Signet. Oh my gosh, this is just like the first match. Daniel plays Waterlogged Grove and taps it, paying 1 life, to cast Finhorn Elves. Chris plays an Island and casts Mirror Maid, having it become a copy of Soul Ring. While Daniel plays Firelit Thicket, pays another life into his grove, and casts his general, Animar. And passes. Chris plays Exotic Orchard, and casts Arcane Signet, followed by his general, Gyruda. With its ETB, each player mills 4 cards. Then from those cards, Chris puts Evil Twin into play as a copy of Gyruda. Due to the legend rule, he sends away the original. The copied Gyruda's ETB happens, and another 4 cards get milled. And from those cards, Chris puts Ancestral Statue into play. With its ETB, he bounces the twin back to his hand and passes. For Daniel's turn, he plays Fiery Islet and casts Arbor Elf, followed by Philbit the Lost, which gains Animar 2 +1/+1 counters, as well as a free draw. Next, he casts Darkside Extortionist. With its ETB, he gains 5 treasure tokens, as well as another counter for Animar. Next, he sacks 2 tokens to cast Beast Whisperer, placing another counter on Animar. Next, he sacks another treasure to cast Reclamation Sage. With its ETB, he destroys the statue, places another counter on Animar, and draws a card via his Whisperer. Then he sacks his last 2 treasures to cast Neoform, and sacks his Philbit to net Imperial Recruiter from his deck into play. With its ETB, he adds Collector Oof from his deck to his hand, but he shortcuts and moves into combat and attacks with Animar. Chris declares no blocks and takes 6 damage before the turn comes to an end. Chris plays a Swamp and recasts his General. With its ETB, they each mill 4 cards again, and for these, Chris puts Vizier of Many Faces into play, and it becomes a copy of Gyruda. But this time he sends the Vizier to the graveyard and keeps the original. The ETB still happens, and both players each mill 4 cards again. This time Chris puts Clever Impersonator into play as a copy of Gyruda, and chooses to send it to the grave as well, off the legend rule. Once the ETB happens again, Gyruda's effect makes each player mill 4 cards once more, and from this, Chris puts Cloud of Fairies from Daniel's deck into play. With its ETB, he gets to untap 2 lands. Then from his graveyard, he jumpstarts a Quasi-Duplicate, discarding a card to make a copy of Gyruda. Then he sacks the copy. With its ETB, another 4 cards are milled. And then Chris puts Thassa Deep Dwelling from among them into play. Then he passes. During the end step, Thassa's effect happens, and he blinks Gyruda. With its ETB, another 4 cards are milled, and he puts the OG Clone into play as a copy of Gyruda. And of course sacks it, forcing another ETB trigger of Gyruda, and another 4 cards are milled. Chris then gets, oh yeah, Deadeye Navigator into play, which then soul bonds with Gyruda before Chris finally passes. Daniel taps his Grove, paying 1 life, and casts Collector Oof. This places a counter on Animar, and he draws a card via his Whisperer. Then he sacks his Islet to draw a card. Then he plays Rejuvenating Springs tapped, and moves into combat and attacks with Animar. Chris blocks with his fairies, and Daniel passes. Even with half his mana shut off, Chris is unfazed, and uses his Deadeye's effect to blink Gyruda. The ETB occurs, and another 4 cards are milled, and from them Chris places Dark Confidant into play. He then chooses to blink Gyruda again and repeat the process, milling another 4 cards. This time he gets Sakashima the Imposter, which ETBs as a copy of Gyruda but keeps its own name. The Gyruda ETB happens again, another 4 cards get milled, and this time Chris puts Spark Double into play with a +1/+1 counter, as another copy of a non-legendary-ish Gyruda. Once again the ETB triggers, and this time Chris gets Sakashima of 1,000 Faces into play, which also comes in as a copy of Gyruda, and now the legend rule is not even a factor anymore. The Gyruda ETB happens again, and from the milled cards, he puts Phantasmal Image into play as a copy of Sakashima of 1,000 Faces, which he then has become a copy of Gyruda, which triggers the Gyruda ETB again. Another 4 cards are milled, and from these cards, Chris puts Wall of Stolen Identity into play, and has it become another Sakashima of 1,000 Faces, which becomes yet another Gyruda. This also taps down the Sakashima of 1,000 Faces. Again, rinse and repeat the Gyruda ETB here, and this time Chris takes Daniel's Phantasmal Image, which becomes a copy of Spark Double, which then copies into Gyruda. Again, the ETB happens. Wow, so many triggers. And finally, both players have no creature targets. Chris then passes, and during the end step, Thassa blinks Gyruda for another Gyruda ETB. Again, each player mills 4 more cards, and then Chris puts Snapcaster Mage into play. With its ETB, he flashes back Brainstorm, which lets him draw 3 cards, and then place 2 cards in his hand to the top of his deck before the turn is over. Daniel starts his turn by casting Elvish Visionary, which places another counter on Animar, and he draws 2 cards from the ETB and his Whisperer. Then he chooses to throw Caution to the Wind and casts Kozilek, Butcher of Truth, which places another counter on Animar, and between the ETB and his Whisperer has him draw 5 cards. He then plays a Forest, and then a miracle play happens, as he evokes, of all things, Endurance, paying 1 life, and exiles Heroic Intervention from his hand. And with Endurance's ETB, he basically sends his entire graveyard to the bottom of his deck, effectively shutting down all the mill that Chris has done. He also draws a card via his Whisperer and places a counter on Animar. Next he casts Sylvan Safekeeper. Animar gets another counter, and Daniel gets another free draw before passing and discarding down to 7 cards. For Chris's turn, he reveals his top card via Dark Confidant, which is an island. Chris uses his Deadeye to blink Gyruda. The ETB happens, and Chris puts Sakashima's Student into play as a copy of the Spark Double, which becomes a Gyruda. Another Gyruda trigger happens. Chris gets to put Cloud of Fairies again from Daniel into play, and untaps 2 more lands. He uses said mana to blink Gyruda again, and this time from the milled cards from the trigger, he puts Mirror Hall Mimic into play as another Spark Double, which becomes Gyruda, and then another Gyruda trigger happens. And this time he puts Coiling Oracle into play. With its ETB, he reveals his final card from his deck, Scroll Rack, which goes to his hand. Then he goes into his first and final combat and attacks with all his 6/6 Gyruda clones. Daniel blocks 5 of them, including 1 with his Kozilek, and takes 6 damage. In his second main phase, Chris casts Scroll Rack and passes. Daniel starts his turn by paying 2 life and casts Phyrexian Metamorph, which places another counter on Animar, and he has an ETB as a copy of Kozilek, and sacks it, and thanks to the Whisperer gets to draw 1 card. Next he casts Spellseeker, placing another counter on Animar, drawing a free card from the Whisperer, with its ETB, adds Worldly Tutor from his deck to his hand. He casts said tutor immediately to place Ancestral Statue on top of his deck. Next he casts Wood Elves, which place another counter on Animar, lets him draw the statue, and add a forest from his deck into play. Then he casts the statue, which lets him draw a card, and place another counter on Animar. Thanks to Animar and the statue with the Whisperer in play, he can now continuously bounce the statue back to its hand with his own ETB, place loads of counters on Animar, and draw as many cards as he wishes. He casts Allosaurus Shepherd next, followed by Eternal Witness. With its ETB, he adds Worldly Tutor from his graveyard to his hand. Then he casts Peregrine Drake, which he uses to untap 5 lands. Then he casts Worldly Tutor again to place Walking Ballista on top of his deck. He recasts the statue to draw the card, and then finally casts the Walking Ballista with more than enough counter energy to send our beloved Commander Mechanic to the Shadow Realm. Well, compared to the first game, this was super close. I never imagined Gyruda being used in a powerful clone-based mill deck, but wow, in most situations, I think our Commander Mechanic would have ran away with the game. Here I thought he had it won, had it not been for a complete heart of the cards moment from Mr. Daniel. I mean, I don't know about you, but how many games of EDH have you seen this year where endurance is used to save the day? With our picks? Let us know in the comments. Also, if you enjoy our content, consider becoming a patron. We'll give you access to some sweet extras like bonus entries into our giveaways, your nickname in the EDH CC Club, and so much more. Also, if you don't mind, on our route to 2,000 subs, please smash the like and subscribe buttons. It really helps out. Well, until next time, thank you all for watching. It means a lot to me. Stay warm, stay safe, have a very happy holiday, and keep on card gaming. Love you all, and cheers.